42,000 years ago, something happened that should have ended our story before it truly began. Picture this. You're standing under a night sky, but instead of the familiar darkness punctuated by stars, the entire heavens are alive with dancing sheets of light. Aurora borealis stretches from horizon to horizon, not just at the poles, but everywhere. The air itself crackles with electricity, and lightning storms rage with an intensity that defies nature. This isn't science fiction. This is Earth during what scientists now call the Adams event, named after Douglas Adams and his famous number 42. It was a time when our planet's magnetic shield collapsed almost entirely, leaving every living thing exposed to the full fury of cosmic radiation. What I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you think about human survival and the delicate balance that keeps our world habitable. This isn't just another extinction event buried in the geological record. This is the story of how our ancestors faced the ultimate test, how some species vanished forever, and how humanity itself nearly became just another footnote in Earth's long history of failed experiments. The evidence for this catastrophe was hidden for millennia, locked away in the rings of a single extraordinary tree. Deep in the swamps of New Zealand, archaeologists discovered something that would rewrite our understanding of prehistoric disaster. It was a kauri tree, massive beyond imagination, with a trunk spanning more than 8 feet across. This ancient giant had lived for approximately 2,000 years, and remarkably it had lived through the Adams event itself. Every ring in its wood was a time capsule, preserving the chemical signature of those terrible centuries when Earth's magnetic field nearly vanished. Scientists extracted sequential blocks of wood, each representing 40 years of the tree's life, and subjected them to the most precise dating techniques available. What they found was nothing short of extraordinary. The levels of carbon-14 in the wood, produced when cosmic rays slip past our magnetic field and strike the atmosphere, told a story of unprecedented crisis. During the Adams event, cosmic radiation bombardment increased so dramatically that the tree's rings became a permanent record of our planet's brush with annihilation. But let me paint you the full picture of what this collapse actually meant. Earth's magnetic field, our invisible shield against the cosmos, dropped to just 6% of its normal strength. For several hundred years, we essentially had no protection at all. Imagine removing the atmosphere from around our planet, except instead of losing air, we lost our defense against the most dangerous forces in the universe. Solar flares that would normally be deflected harmlessly into space came crashing through our magnetosphere like cosmic bullets. Galactic cosmic rays, the high-energy remnants of ancient supernovas, flooded our atmosphere with radiation levels that would be lethal to most life forms. The sky itself became a battlefield. Our ancestors would have witnessed light shows that make today's most spectacular auroras look like flickering candles. But these weren't beautiful displays to admire. They were visible manifestations of our planet being stripped of its protective barriers. The ionized air became a perfect conductor for electrical storms of unimaginable intensity. Lightning strikes increased dramatically as the very atmosphere became charged with cosmic energy. The ozone layer, our secondary defense against harmful radiation, began to disintegrate under this cosmic assault. Computer models suggest that the bombardment of charged particles created massive quantities of hydrogen and nitrogen oxides, molecules that consume ozone with devastating efficiency. As the ozone disappeared, ultraviolet radiation from our own sun joined the cosmic assault, creating a double threat that pushed life on Earth to its absolute limits. The timing of this disaster is what makes it truly remarkable. 42,000 years ago places us right in the middle of some of the most significant developments in human evolution and behavior. This wasn't just a random cosmic event. It was a filter, a test that determined which species would survive and which would vanish forever. Consider the evidence that's been staring us in the face for decades. Around 42,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals disappeared from Western Europe. These weren't primitive cavemen, but sophisticated humans with their own technologies and cultures. They had survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and countless other challenges, yet something around this exact time frame pushed them over the edge into extinction. The megafauna of Australia tells an equally dramatic story. Giant kangaroos, massive marsupial lions, and creatures that resembled rhinoceros-sized wombats, all vanished around the same period. For years, scientists debated whether human hunting or climate change caused these extinctions. Now we understand that the Adams event may have been the crucial factor that tipped the balance. When cosmic radiation bombarded the atmosphere and ozone depletion intensified ultraviolet exposure, these large animals became living targets in an increasingly hostile environment. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. While other species succumbed to this cosmic catastrophe, our ancestors didn't just survive. They adapted in ways that reveal the extraordinary ingenuity of early humans. The archaeological record from this period shows a sudden and dramatic increase in cave art around the world. These weren't just decorative drawings. They represent one of humanity's first great technological responses to environmental crisis. Think about it logically. As ultraviolet radiation intensified due to ozone depletion, the surface world became increasingly dangerous. Caves offered natural protection, underground shelters where humans could escape the deadly rays. But they didn't just hide. They transformed these refuges into humanity's first art galleries, covering the walls with handprints, geometric patterns, and depictions of the animals they hunted. The evidence suggests something even more remarkable. Many of these cave paintings were created using red ochre, a naturally occurring pigment that modern science has confirmed possesses sunscreen-like properties. This wasn't accidental. Our ancestors had discovered that ochre could protect exposed skin from ultraviolet radiation. Indigenous communities in Namibia and Australia still use ochre as sunscreen today, a practice that may stretch back 42,000 years to this original crisis. Archaeological sites from this period show a dramatic increase in ochre use, not just for cave paintings but as body paint. Handprints made with red ochre appear in caves across multiple continents, all dating to roughly the same time frame. This represents one of humanity's earliest examples of global technological adaptation. Faced with an environmental threat that could have ended our species, our ancestors developed practical solutions that allowed them to survive where others perished. The sophistication of this response becomes even more apparent when you consider the clothing evidence. Archaeological sites from the Adams event period show a sudden increase in tools designed for tailoring fitted clothing. This wasn't just about staying warm. Properly fitted garments provided crucial protection against intensified ultraviolet radiation. While Neanderthals may have lacked these advanced clothing technologies, modern humans were developing comprehensive protection systems that covered both chemical sunscreen and physical barriers. The scale of this crisis extended far beyond individual survival strategies. Computer simulations suggest that the combination of cosmic radiation bombardment and ozone depletion created atmospheric conditions unlike anything humans had previously encountered. The very air became hostile to life, charged with particles and stripped of its protective chemistry. Yet somehow, against odds that should have been insurmountable, our species not only survived but emerged from this crisis stronger and more innovative than before. The Adams event may have been the crucible that forged truly modern human behavior, forcing our ancestors to develop the technological adaptability and cultural cooperation that would eventually allow us to dominate the planet. This is just the beginning of the story. What happened next would determine not just human survival, but the entire trajectory of life on Earth. The question that haunts researchers today is simple, yet terrifying. What would happen if it occurred again? The Adams event wasn't just a historical curiosity buried in ancient tree rings. It was a preview of our planet's vulnerability, a glimpse into forces that could reshape civilization itself, and the evidence suggests we might not have to wait much longer to find out. Earth's magnetic field is already showing disturbing signs of instability. Over the past 170 years, our protective shield has weakened by approximately 9%. That might not sound dramatic, but in geological terms it's happening at breakneck speed. The European Space Agency's Swarm satellite constellation has detected something even more alarming. Our magnetic field is deteriorating 10 times faster than previously calculated, losing strength at a rate of 5% per decade rather than 5% per century. There's a region stretching from Africa to South America where the magnetic field is particularly weak, an anomaly so pronounced that satellites passing through it experience technical malfunctions. This South Atlantic anomaly is expanding and deepening, creating a growing hole in our planetary defense system. The North Magnetic Pole itself has been wandering more rapidly in recent years, drifting away from its traditional position with accelerating speed. Scientists tracking these changes estimate that a full magnetic reversal could begin within the next 2,000 years. That sounds like a distant threat, but remember, the Adams event lasted only 800 years, and its effects persisted for millennia afterward. In the context of human civilization, 2,000 years is nothing. It's the blink of an eye between now and when the Roman Empire was at its peak. But let's return to that crucial period 42,000 years ago and understand exactly how our ancestors managed to survive when so many other species failed. The key lies in understanding that this wasn't just about individual toughness or luck. It was about developing systems, technologies, and social behaviors that could protect entire communities from an invisible but deadly threat. The cave art phenomenon reveals something profound about early human psychology and cooperation. These weren't isolated individuals hiding in random caves. The evidence suggests coordinated responses across vast distances. Caves in Spain, France, Australia, and South America all show similar increases in artistic activity during the same time frame. This implies communication networks and shared knowledge that spanned continents. Consider the logistics of what our ancestors accomplished. Creating cave art required planning, resource gathering, and sustained effort over long periods. The pigments had to be sourced, prepared, and transported. Tools for application needed to be crafted. Most importantly, the knowledge of which pigments provided protection had to be discovered, tested, and transmitted across generations and between groups. The red ochre discovery represents one of humanity's earliest examples of what we might call applied chemistry. Somewhere, somehow, our ancestors figured out that this particular mineral could shield them from radiation they couldn't see or understand. They didn't know about ultraviolet wavelengths or ozone depletion, but they recognized cause and effect. When they used ochre, they survived better. When they didn't, they suffered. This knowledge spread with remarkable efficiency. Ochre use appears simultaneously across multiple continents during the Adams event period, suggesting either independent discovery or rapid transmission of information. Either scenario reveals cognitive capabilities that set our species apart from our extinct relatives. The clothing revolution that accompanied this crisis tells an equally compelling story. The archaeological record shows a sudden proliferation of bone needles, awls, and other tools specifically designed for working with hides and fibers. This wasn't gradual technological evolution, it was rapid adaptation to immediate survival needs. Fitted clothing provided protection that loose animal skins couldn't match. It created a sealed barrier against radiation while allowing mobility and flexibility. The pattern of tool development suggests our ancestors understood the relationship between clothing construction and environmental protection, even if they couldn't articulate the underlying physics. Meanwhile, the Neanderthals, despite their intelligence and cultural sophistication, appear to have lacked these crucial adaptations. Their clothing technology remained relatively primitive. Their use of ochre was limited compared to modern humans. Their cave occupation patterns don't show the same systematic response to environmental crisis. This wasn't about intelligence in the abstract sense. Neanderthals had larger brains than modern humans and were capable of complex behaviors, but they may have lacked the specific combination of technological innovation and social cooperation that allowed our ancestors to develop comprehensive protection systems during the crisis. The megafauna extinctions paint an even starker picture of what happens when species can't adapt quickly enough to rapidly changing conditions. These massive animals had survived previous climate shifts, ice ages, and even early human hunting pressure. But the Adams event created conditions they simply couldn't handle. Large body size, which had been an advantage in cold climates, became a liability under intense cosmic radiation. Bigger animals presented larger targets for harmful rays. Their slow reproduction rates meant they couldn't quickly adapt to changing conditions. Most critically, they lacked the behavioral flexibility to seek shelter or modify their environments for protection. The giant kangaroos of Australia, some standing over 8 feet tall, had dominated their ecosystems for millions of years. They had weathered ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and dramatic sea level changes. Yet within a few thousand years of the Adams event, they were gone. Their disappearance wasn't gradual decline, it was rapid collapse across an entire continent. Similar patterns emerged worldwide. The cave bears of Europe, massive predators that had ruled their territories for hundreds of thousands of years, vanished during this same period. The woolly rhinoceros, despite being perfectly adapted to cold climates, couldn't survive the radiation bombardment and ozone depletion. But the story of the Adams event extends beyond simple survival and extinction. It reveals something fundamental about the relationship between environmental crisis and evolutionary innovation. The species that survived didn't just endure the catastrophe. They emerged transformed, equipped with new capabilities that would serve them long after the crisis passed. Human cave art didn't disappear when the magnetic field recovered. It evolved into more sophisticated forms, eventually leading to the complex symbolic systems that underlie all human culture. The clothing technologies developed during the crisis became the foundation for textile production that would eventually clothe civilizations. The social cooperation required to survive the Adams event may have been the catalyst for the complex societies that followed. Groups that learned to share information, coordinate responses, and support vulnerable members during the crisis were more likely to survive. These behaviors became embedded in human culture, creating the cooperative frameworks that would eventually build cities, nations, and global civilizations. This transformation wasn't limited to humans. The species that survived the Adams event often showed increased behavioral complexity afterward. They'd been forced to develop new strategies, explore different habitats, and modify their behaviors in ways that prepared them for future challenges. The recovery period following the Adams event saw an explosion of innovation and expansion. human populations began spreading into previously uninhabitable regions. New technologies appeared with increasing frequency. Art became more sophisticated and widespread. It was as if the crisis had compressed evolutionary pressures into a brief period, accelerating development that might otherwise have taken tens of thousands of years. Yet the shadow of that ancient catastrophe still haunts our modern world. The same forces that nearly destroyed our ancestors remain active today, and our technological civilization may be even more vulnerable to their effects than prehistoric hunter-gatherers ever were. The implications of what happened during the Adams event become truly terrifying when you consider how dependent our modern world has become on the very systems that would be most vulnerable to another magnetic field collapse. Imagine waking up tomorrow to find that every satellite orbiting our planet has been fried by cosmic radiation. Your GPS stops working. Weather forecasting becomes impossible. Communication networks spanning continents simply vanish. This isn't science fiction speculation. It's the inevitable result of what happens when charged particles from space encounter unprotected electronic systems. During the Adams event, our ancestors faced cosmic radiation with stone tools and animal hides. We would face it with power grids, satellites, and computer networks that have never been tested against such extreme conditions. The economic analysis is sobering. Researchers estimate that a complete collapse of the United States power grid due to space weather events could cost over $1 trillion. That's just one country, and that's assuming the damage could be repaired relatively quickly. During a magnetic field reversal lasting centuries, the damage would compound exponentially, but the power grid failure would be just the beginning. Modern agriculture depends on GPS-guided tractors, satellite-monitored weather patterns, and computer-controlled irrigation systems. Food production would collapse not because crops couldn't grow, but because we've forgotten how to farm without our electronic assistance. Transportation would grind to a halt as navigation systems failed, and communication between airports, ships, and vehicles became impossible. Supply chains that stretch across continents would snap like overtaxed cables. Within weeks, cities would face shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. The medical implications are equally devastating. Hospitals rely on electronic systems for everything from patient monitoring to drug delivery. During a magnetic field collapse, life support systems would fail, diagnostic equipment would malfunction, and the complex logistics of modern healthcare would disintegrate. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of our vulnerability is how completely unprepared we are psychologically for such an event. Our ancestors who survived the Adams event had lived their entire lives understanding that survival required constant adaptation to environmental threats. They knew how to find food without supermarkets, how to navigate without satellites, how to communicate across distances without electronics. We have traded that hard-won resilience for convenience and efficiency. The same technological systems that allow us to feed billions of people and coordinate global civilization have created dependencies that make us extraordinarily fragile when those systems fail. The irony is profound. 42,000 years ago, humans survived the Adams event because they were adaptable, resourceful, and capable of rapid innovation under pressure. Today, we might be the least adaptable humans who've ever lived. Our survival strategies have become so specialized and dependent on complex infrastructure that we've lost the fundamental skills that once saved our species. But there's another dimension to this vulnerability that makes the threat even more immediate. Climate change is already stressing our planetary systems in ways that would amplify the effects of another magnetic field collapse. Our atmosphere already contains carbon dioxide levels unprecedented in human history. If cosmic radiation and ozone depletion were added to this existing crisis, the combined effects could trigger environmental changes that would make the original Adams event look manageable by comparison. The atmospheric chemistry during a magnetic field reversal would create a feedback loop with existing climate change. Cosmic radiation would break down greenhouse gases in complex ways, while simultaneously destroying ozone that protects us from solar radiation. The result would be rapid and unpredictable changes to weather patterns that are already becoming increasingly unstable. Ocean currents, which depend partly on magnetic field interactions with solar radiation, could shift dramatically during a reversal. This would alter global temperature distribution and precipitation patterns in ways that could make vast regions uninhabitable within decades rather than centuries. The agricultural implications are staggering. Modern crop varieties have been developed for stable climate conditions and predictable growing seasons. Sudden changes in temperature, precipitation, and radiation levels would devastate food production just when human populations are at their highest levels in history. Urban populations, which now comprise more than half of humanity, would be particularly vulnerable. Cities depend on complex supply networks that extend hundreds or thousands of miles from their centers. When those networks fail, urban areas become death traps where millions of people compete for rapidly dwindling resources. The social and political consequences of such a crisis would unfold with frightening speed. Modern governments depend on communication networks, transportation systems, and economic structures that would collapse during a magnetic field reversal. The social contracts that hold societies together would dissolve as quickly as the electronic systems that enable them. Yet there are lessons we can learn from how our ancestors survived the original Adams event. The key wasn't superior technology or favourable conditions. It was behavioural adaptability and social cooperation under extreme stress. They succeeded because they could rapidly develop new strategies, share crucial information, and support community members who couldn't protect themselves. The archaeological evidence shows that survival during the Adams event required both individual innovation and collective action. The cave art phenomenon wasn't just about protecting individuals from radiation. It represented community gathering places where knowledge could be shared, social bonds maintained, and cultural information preserved across generations. The ochre technology reveals how quickly human communities could identify, test, and distribute life-saving innovations. Within a few generations, protective practices had spread across continents and become embedded in cultural traditions that persisted long after the original threat had passed. Modern humans retain these same cognitive capabilities, but we've organized our societies in ways that discourage their development. We've become specialists in narrow fields rather than generalists capable of adapting to unexpected challenges. We've created institutions that prioritize efficiency over resilience and centralize systems that offer no backup when primary methods fail. The question facing our species isn't whether another magnetic field reversal will occur, but whether we'll be prepared when it does. The geological evidence suggests we're already in the early stages of magnetic field instability that could accelerate into full reversal within centuries or millennia. Some scientists argue that we should be investing heavily in hardened electronic systems that could survive cosmic radiation bombardment. Others suggest developing backup technologies that don't depend on satellite networks or centralized power grids. Both approaches have merit, but they miss the deeper lesson of the Adams event. Our ancestors survived not because they had better tools, but because they maintained the psychological flexibility to abandon failed strategies and embrace radical changes when circumstances demanded it. They could transform their entire way of life within a single generation when survival required such transformation. This mental agility may be our most important survival trait, yet it's exactly what modern civilization seems designed to suppress. We build institutions that resist change, create economic systems that punish adaptation, and develop social structures that reward conformity over innovation. The Adams event offers both warning and hope. It demonstrates that our planet can become hostile to life with terrifying speed, but it also proves that intelligent cooperative species can survive even the most extreme environmental catastrophes. The question is whether we'll choose to learn from our ancestors' success or repeat our extinct relatives' failures. The evidence suggests that preparation for another magnetic field collapse should focus less on technological solutions and more on developing the social resilience that allowed our ancestors to thrive during the original crisis. We need communities that can function without centralized infrastructure, individuals who understand basic survival skills, and institutions that can adapt rapidly to changing conditions. But perhaps most importantly, we need to recover the sense of environmental humility that our ancestors possessed. They understood that human survival depends on forces beyond our control, and the adaptation rather than domination is the key to long-term species success. The story of the Adams event isn't just ancient history, it's a preview of challenges that may be much closer than we imagine. The magnetic field instabilities detected by modern satellites suggest that we're living in the early stages of changes that could unfold with the same devastating speed that characterized the original crisis. The tree rings that revealed the Adams event continue to tell their story, measuring changes in cosmic radiation that reflect the ongoing evolution of our planet's magnetic field. Each year of growth records conditions that our descendants may need to understand if they're to survive what's coming next. The question isn't whether another Adams event will occur, but whether we'll be wise enough to learn from the first one before it's too late. The signs are already manifesting in ways that should terrify anyone paying attention. Scientists monitoring the South Atlantic anomaly have watched it expand and intensify over the past decade with accelerating speed. Satellites passing through this weakened region of our magnetic field experience the same types of malfunctions that would become universal during a full reversal. Computer systems crash, navigation equipment fails, and communication arrays go dark. What makes this particularly ominous is that we're witnessing these effects while our magnetic field is still relatively strong. The anomaly represents only a partial weakening, yet it's already causing measurable damage to our most sophisticated technologies. During the Adams event, when the field dropped to 6% of normal strength globally, these malfunctions would become the baseline condition for all electronic systems on Earth. The wandering of the magnetic North Pole provides another disturbing indicator of instability. For centuries, compass readings changed gradually and predictably as the pole drifted slowly across the Arctic. But in recent decades, this movement has accelerated dramatically. The pole is now racing across the landscape at speeds that force constant updates to navigation systems worldwide. This acceleration suggests that the fundamental dynamics controlling our magnetic field are entering a period of rapid change. The same processes that generated the Adams event 42,000 years ago are stirring to life beneath our feet. Deep within Earth's core, the churning molten iron that creates our magnetic shield is reorganizing itself in patterns that could flip our entire planetary field within a geological instant. The implications extend far beyond simple technological failure. During the original Adams event, the collapse of magnetic protection triggered a cascade of atmospheric changes that persisted for thousands of years after the field recovered. Even if a future reversal lasted only the typical few centuries, its environmental consequences would reshape human civilization for millennia. Modern climate modelling suggests that cosmic radiation bombardment during a magnetic reversal would interact with existing greenhouse gases in unpredictable ways. The same particles that once destroyed ancient ozone layers would now encounter an atmosphere already saturated with carbon dioxide, methane, and other industrial emissions. The chemical reactions triggered by this collision could accelerate climate change beyond anything our current models predict. The agricultural systems that feed 8 billion people have never been tested against the radiation levels that characterize the Adams event. Modern crops have been bred for maximum yield under stable conditions, not for survival under cosmic bombardment. The genetic diversity that once allowed wild plants to adapt quickly to environmental stress has been systematically eliminated in favor of uniformity and productivity. When cosmic rays begin penetrating our weakened magnetic field, they won't just damage electronic systems, they'll alter the fundamental chemistry of photosynthesis, disrupt plant reproduction, and trigger genetic mutations that could collapse entire crop species within a single growing season. The green revolution that allowed human population to explode over the past century could reverse with equal speed. The urban concentrations that now house most of humanity would become death traps within weeks of a magnetic collapse. Cities exist only because of constant flows of food, energy, and materials from distant sources. When the transportation networks that maintain these flows fail simultaneously across the globe, urban populations would face starvation on a scale never before witnessed in human history. Yet the most terrifying aspect of our vulnerability may be psychological rather than physical. Our ancestors who survived the Adams event possessed mental frameworks that allowed them to accept radical change as natural and necessary. They understood that survival sometimes requires abandoning everything familiar and embracing completely new ways of life. Modern humans have been conditioned to expect stability, predictability, and gradual change. Our institutions, our economies, and our personal identities are built around the assumption that tomorrow will be fundamentally similar to today. When that assumption proves false, as it inevitably will during a magnetic reversal, the psychological shock could be as devastating as the physical effects. The cave art that proliferated during the original Adams event represents more than just artistic expression. It reveals communities that could maintain social cohesion and cultural continuity even while retreating underground for protection. These weren't isolated individuals hiding in random caves. They were organized societies that transformed crisis into opportunity for innovation. Consider the level of cooperation required to create the elaborate cave paintings found across multiple continents. Teams of artists working by firelight in cramped, dangerous conditions. Pigment gatherers risking exposure to deadly radiation to collect ochre from distant sources. Toolmakers crafting specialized implements for applying paint to stone surfaces. Knowledge keepers preserving and transmitting the cultural information that gave meaning to these underground galleries. This represents a form of civilizational resilience that modern society has systematically eliminated in favor of efficiency and specialization. We've created systems so complex and interdependent that the failure of any critical component can trigger cascading collapse across entire networks. The financial systems that coordinate global trade depend on satellite communications and electronic networks that would fail instantly during a magnetic reversal. The supply chains that deliver food to supermarkets rely on GPS navigation and computerized logistics that cosmic radiation would destroy. The power grids that energize modern life use electronic controls that have never been hardened against space weather events. When these systems fail simultaneously, there are no backup alternatives. We've forgotten the knowledge that allowed previous generations to function without electronic assistance. Most people today couldn't grow food, navigate by stars, or communicate across distances without the technological infrastructure we've come to take for granted. The medical implications alone should motivate immediate preparation for magnetic field collapse. Modern hospitals are entirely dependent on electronic systems that would be rendered inoperable by cosmic radiation bombardment. Life support equipment, diagnostic machines, drug delivery systems and patient monitoring devices would all fail when unprotected electronics encounter the particle storm that characterize magnetic reversals. The pharmaceutical industry relies on global supply chains and precise manufacturing processes that require stable electronic control systems. During a magnetic collapse, production of essential medications would halt just when populations would be most vulnerable to radiation-induced illnesses and stress-related health problems. The tree rings of that ancient kauri in New Zealand continue to whisper their warning across the millennia, each ring a testament to survival against impossible odds. 42,000 years ago, our ancestors faced annihilation and chose adaptation over extinction. They painted caves with ochre sunscreen, tailored protective clothing, and built communities that could endure in darkness while the sky burned above them. Today, as our magnetic field weakens and wanders with accelerating urgency, we face the same fundamental choice our predecessors confronted in those flickering cave galleries. Will we learn from their ingenuity and resilience, or will we join the Neanderthals and giant kangaroos in the fossil record of species that couldn't adapt quickly enough? The Adams event isn't ancient history. It's a preview of tomorrow, written in cosmic radiation and preserved in tree rings. Our ancestors survived by embracing change, sharing knowledge, and protecting their communities through cooperation rather than isolation. They understood that survival isn't about having the best tools, but about maintaining the mental flexibility to abandon what doesn't work and embrace what does. The signs are already manifesting around us. Satellites malfunction over the South Atlantic anomaly. The magnetic North Pole races across the Arctic at unprecedented speeds. Our protective shield weakens with each passing decade. The question isn't whether another magnetic collapse will come, but whether we'll be ready when the sky begins to burn once more. But to really feel the weight of what happened 42,000 years ago, we have to go deeper than tree rings and satellite readings. We have to step inside the machine that made it all possible and dangerous in the first place. Beneath your feet, far below the crust and the mantle, there is a sea of metal. Not calm, not still, but boiling and turning in slow, planetary spirals. The outer core of Earth is a sphere of molten iron and nickel, hotter than the surface of the sun in places, squeezed under pressures we can barely imagine. In that churning ocean of metal, electric currents loop and twist, and from those currents our magnetic field is born. You can picture it, if you like, as a colossal invisible lighthouse, a double spiral of force lines that burst out near the South Pole, sweep far into space, and dive back into the north. Charged particles from the sun, racing toward us at hundreds of kilometers per second, feel those lines of force and are turned away, pushed outward into a vast teardrop-shaped bubble we call the magnetosphere. Most of the time we never notice it. The shield simply works, quietly, tirelessly, century after century. But nothing in nature is perfectly stable. Down in the outer core, the iron does not flow in neat, orderly loops. It surges and eddies, it splits and recombines, it forms whirlpools and plumes. Imagine staring into a pot of water at a slow boil. Currents forming, dissolving, reappearing in new shapes. Now imagine that pot is the size of a planet and has been boiling for 4.5 billion years. Small shifts in that hellish ocean of metal can have enormous consequences for the field that grows out of it. Sometimes, those currents reorganize themselves in ways that flip the entire magnetic field. North becomes south, south becomes north. To life on the surface, the rocks do not move, the continents do not suddenly slide, but the invisible compass of the planet swings through space. We call these geomagnetic reversals, and the geological record is striped with them. Layers of lava frozen with their magnetic minerals pointing one way, then the other, like ancient tapes on which Earth recorded the direction of its own heartbeat. Other times, the field doesn't commit to a full reversal. It staggers, falters, tilts wildly off-center, and grows weak. An excursion rather than a complete flip. The Adams event was one of these excursions, but to the creatures living at the time, that distinction would have meant very little. For them, the sky changed, the air changed, the rules changed. If you could float above the Earth during that time and watch from orbit, a dangerous place to stand with so little magnetic protection, you'd have seen something extraordinary. The auroral ovals that today hug the polar regions would have stretched toward the equator, swelling and writhing as solar storms struck. Curtains of light in crimson, violet and electric green would have unrolled over Australia, Africa, Europe, the Americas. Night would rarely have been truly dark, and beneath those glowing skies entire species would have been disoriented in ways we're only beginning to understand. Many animals don't just see the world, they feel the magnetic field like an extra sense, a hidden compass humming quietly in the background of their awareness. Birds use it to navigate across oceans in unerring lines. Sea turtles feel it as they cross the world's basins and return to the same beaches where they hatched. Salmon, whales, even tiny bacteria carry internal instruments that tune themselves to Earth's magnetic structure. During the Adams event, those invisible maps would have warped and scrambled. Migration routes that had worked for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly became dangerous. Flocks could have flown in the wrong direction, guided by a sky whose magnetic poles no longer matched its geography. Whales might have stranded themselves on unfamiliar coasts, following field lines that twisted into new patterns. Entire ecosystems would have felt a confusion that doesn't fossilize, but that we can infer from the biology of the creatures that still rely on that sense today. For our ancestors, the change would have been stranger still. Humans don't consciously feel the magnetic field. We live inside it without noticing it, the way a fish lives inside water, but we do notice consequences. The climate shifts. The sky behaves strangely. The animals migrate differently. The seasons bring storms and winds and failures of food that don't match older patterns. When people gathered around their fires at night during those centuries of instability, it wasn't just the red auroras they whispered about. It was the sense that the world itself had become unreliable. The cycles that shaped life, day and night, summer and winter, storm and calm, no longer followed familiar rhythms. In that uncertainty, stories would have flourished, explanations, myths. You can imagine them, if you like. Tales of a sky spirit wounded and bleeding light, stories of a tear in the heavens where the world above was leaking into the world below. Perhaps, in some long-vanished language, there were words for a sun that burned too fiercely and air that stung the skin. In cultures that carved no monuments and left no written records, the only traces of those stories are the patterns we still find today. The almost universal myths of angry skies, vengeful suns, floods of fire or light, ages when the heavens themselves turned against the people below. We don't know which myths, if any, hold distant memories of the Adams event. But when you listen to them, to legends of red skies, of nights as bright as day, of gods hurling spears of light across the firmament, they feel less abstract. They feel like something that might have roots in a real time when the sky did, quite literally, go mad. While humans painted caves and wrapped themselves in carefully sewn garments, the planet continued its slow, relentless experiments. In the oceans, the increased radiation reaching the surface layers changed more than just chemistry. It changed life itself. DNA, that delicate molecule of inheritance, is vulnerable to high-energy particles. Ionizing radiation can snap its strands, shatter its bases, scramble its code. Most of those changes are harmful or neutral. A damaged cell dies or becomes less efficient. An organism develops a defect. But every so often, a mutation lands in a sweet spot. A change that provides an advantage in the new world. A slightly thicker shell. A pigment that absorbs radiation more safely. A tweak to a protein that makes photosynthesis more robust. During the Adams event, the rates of such mutations almost certainly spiked. Most vanished into oblivion with the individuals that carried them. A few became part of the ongoing story of life, shaping lineages that would unfold over tens of thousands of generations. When you look at the diversity of life in the oceans today, plankton that bloom by the trillions, complex food webs that bind whales to microscopic algae, hidden somewhere in their family trees are branches that first appeared under skies flooded with cosmic rays. The land told a similar story. Plants, rooted where they grew, could not walk into caves or hide beneath rock overhangs. They faced the radiation on open ground. Some wilted and disappeared from whole regions. Others, through a combination of luck and resilience, persisted. Over centuries, the mix of species shifted. Forests changed their composition. Grasslands altered their balance of herbs and shrubs. The world that emerged when the magnetic field recovered was not quite the same as the one that had gone in. For humans, those shifting landscapes meant new challenges and opportunities. Game animals changed their ranges, following the plants they depended on. Old hunting grounds became barren. New ones opened. Water sources moved as precipitation patterns shifted. Communities adapted by learning new routes, new seasonal cycles, new ways of reading the signs of the land. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost walk with them. Across a wind-scoured ridge under a pulsing red sky, the air sharp and cold against your skin. Down into a valley where young pines, newly colonizing, stand like dark spears through the snow. Along a river whose ice is thinner than it should be, reflecting auroral curtains that ripple in streaks of crimson and green. The people move quietly, eyes flicking between the strange heavens and the tracks at their feet, their bodies streaked with ochre beneath their furs. They carry with them more than tools. They carry memory, stories of how the skies used to look, cautionary tales about travelling during certain moons when the radiation feels harsher, even though they have no words for radiation, instruction songs that teach children which caves are safest when the storms rage, which pigments protect the skin best, which animals are still healthy enough to eat when others show signs of sickness. In that sense, the Adams event didn't just push humans toward technological sophistication, it pushed them toward deeper cultural complexity. Survival depended not merely on individual cleverness, but on shared knowledge accumulated over generations. No single person could master all the skills needed to navigate such a dangerous world. Communities became repositories of information, living libraries in which each member held a piece of the collective survival puzzle. When we look at our own species today, at our languages and religions and sciences, we are seeing the long echo of that cultural turn. The instinct to gather information, to test it, to pass it down and refine it. That is one of the legacies of a world where not knowing could mean not living. The magnetic field eventually recovered, As it always does, the currents in the outer core shifted again, aligning themselves in a configuration that strengthened the shield. Over centuries, the auroras retreated back toward the poles. Lightning storms calmed. The ozone layer slowly rebuilt itself. Ultraviolet levels moderated. To creatures living through these centuries, the change would have felt like a slow easing, a subtle sense that the world had become less hostile. But the lessons remained. Humans kept using ochre and other pigments. They kept sewing fitted clothing. They kept painting caves, even when the original survival pressure diminished. Practices born in crisis had become embedded in culture, carrying forward through time as rituals, art, and identity. Thousands of years later, as humans began settling in larger groups, building more permanent dwellings and experimenting with agriculture, the memory of that cosmic ordeal had likely blurred into myth. The red sky had become story, perhaps told to children as a warning or a prophecy. The sense that the heavens could change dramatically, that gods or spirits could withdraw their protection, lingered like a faint flavour in the collective imagination. You can hear that flavour in later traditions. Cultures around the world speak of ages when the sun stood still, when darkness reigned at noon, when fire fell from the sky, when stars rained down, when the sky itself was torn. We don't have to assume that every such tale refers directly to the Adams event. The universe is generous with its dramas. Volcanic eruptions, meteor storms, eclipses, and comets all leave deep impressions. But the idea that the sky can betray us, that something invisible above our heads might suddenly become dangerous, is deeply rooted. Today we understand what our ancestors could not name. We know about solar winds, coronal mass ejections, cosmic rays, ozone chemistry, magnetic field lines. We can measure them with instruments orders of magnitude more precise than anything those early humans possessed. We can simulate their effects on supercomputers and watch magnetic storms unfold in real time on satellite displays. And yet, for all that knowledge, we're in some ways less prepared than they were. If the field began collapsing in earnest within our lifetimes, the first signs wouldn't be red auroras over our cities. They would be technical glitches, GPS signals dropping out more frequently, satellites suffering unexplained failures, bursts of static disrupting communications. Engineers would notice anomalies in radiation readings aboard spacecraft. Astronomers would see sharper, more chaotic spikes in the particle detectors on their observatories. At ground level, power companies might begin to record strange surges in long transmission lines as geomagnetically induced currents sloshed through their networks. Transformers would occasionally fail in odd patterns during solar storms. Airline pilots flying polar routes would be advised to adjust their paths more often to avoid high radiation zones. Scientists would debate. Some would argue that we were simply observing normal fluctuations. Others would point to the weakening field, the accelerating drift of the poles, the growing anomalies, and say, quietly at first, that perhaps we were witnessing the first stirrings of a new excursion. As the weakening deepened, the heavens would slowly start to resemble the skies of 42,000 years ago. Auroras would become common at mid-latitudes. People in cities like Rome, New York, Beijing and Cape Town would step outside at night to find the sky smeared in red and green veils, shimmering silently from horizon to horizon. Social media would fill with photographs and videos. For a while it would feel like a global festival of light. News anchors would speak in excited tones about the beautiful aurora events, quoting experts who would remind viewers that such displays were signs of a stressed magnetosphere. Some would listen, many would simply marvel. Then, one day, a solar storm more powerful than usual would slam into the weakened field. Satellites in high orbit would suddenly go dark. Others would begin to send corrupted data, their electronics having been damaged by radiation. Power grids at high latitudes would experience massive, widespread failures as currents surge through their lines, frying transformers the size of houses. Air traffic controllers would struggle to track flights as navigation systems faltered. Ships at sea would revert to backup procedures, dusting off skills that few crew members still practice. On the surface, people might not feel the particle storm directly, but they would feel its consequences as the infrastructure we depend on began to creak. Governments would convene emergency panels. Plans would be drawn up to harden crucial systems, to reroute satellite orbits, to build more resilient grids. But such transformations take time, and the field would continue to weaken. Every major solar event would deal another blow, another round of damage. The age of seamless connectivity would begin to fray. If the excursion deepened into true collapse, the changes would accelerate. Low Earth orbit would become a zone of intense radiation. Many satellites would be abandoned as too vulnerable to maintain. The ones that remained would require heavy shielding and constant repair. Deep space missions would become far more dangerous to crew and electronics alike. On the ground, ultraviolet levels would climb as the ozone layer suffered repeated chemical assaults. Skin cancer rates would rise. Outdoor work schedules might shift to avoid the most intense radiation hours. Crops would struggle in some regions, forcing rapid experimentation with new varieties and growing techniques. In such a world, the societies that did best would likely look strangely familiar. They would emphasize local knowledge of land and season. They would cultivate a diversity of food sources rather than relying on monocultures. They would invest heavily in community networks that can function when digital communication falters. They would value generalist skills, people who can fix many different things, improvise with limited materials, and teach others how. It is not hard to imagine that in some places humanity might once again seek refuge underground, not in caves lit by fires, but in reinforced habitats shielded from radiation. There, children would grow up hearing stories of the days before the sky changed. Stories of a time when satellites circled overhead, when people could talk instantly across oceans, when nights were mostly dark and stars untroubled by crimson veils. They would, in their own way, be heirs to the people who crouched in the flickering light of torches 42,000 years ago, painting animal shapes and handprints on stone while the sky raged above them. When you stretch your imagination across those tens of thousands of years, you begin to see a pattern. The details of technology and culture change, but the core challenge remains the same. A small, fragile species trying to endure on a planet that is anything but static, under a sun that is anything but gentle, within a universe that has never promised safety. The Adams event is only one flare in that long sequence. There were reversals before it, excursions before it, crises and recoveries flickering through deep time. There will be more after us. The planet will continue its slow breathing, fields strengthening and weakening, poles wandering and flipping, long after the last human story has been told. But we're here now, at this brief intersection, able to look both backward and forward. We can read tree rings and lava flows and ice cores. We can measure the wandering of the magnetic poles with instruments of exquisite precision. We can project, with some confidence, how a collapsing magnetosphere might interact with a warming climate and a hyper-connected civilization. What we do with that knowledge is, for now, still a choice. Our ancestors didn't know why the sky went red. They didn't understand cosmic rays or geomagnetic excursions. But they paid attention, they watched, they experimented. They painted their bodies with ochre and lined their shelters with skins. and they taught their children how to do the same. We, for all our sophistication, are faced with a similar need to pay attention, to watch the signs written not just in tree rings, but in satellite readings and shifting poles, to experiment with ways of living that are less brittle, less dependent on a single layer of technology, to remember that resilience is built long before the crisis arrives. Late at night, when the world around you is quiet and your own screens have gone dark, it can be strangely comforting to think of those ancient people staring up at a sky saturated with red light. They did not know if their world would survive. In many ways, neither do we, but they lit their fires anyway. They held their children close. They passed around stories and pigments and clothing and knowledge. And somehow, against odds that would have seemed impossible if anyone had been there to calculate them, they made it through. You are proof of that survival, a living continuation of a lineage that threaded its way through one of the most dangerous episodes our planet has ever experienced. In your bones and blood is the quiet record of a species that learned, again and again, to bend without breaking. So as you lie here, listening and drifting, you can imagine the slow turning of the molten core far below, the soft glow of auroras far above, the planetary shield humming as it weakens and strengthens over eras. You can imagine the giant corrie in the New Zealand swamp, ring by ring recording every subtle shift in radiation, every spike and lull, standing silently as human stories rise and fall around it. And you can feel, just for a moment, the strange comfort in knowing that you are part of a much longer tale than the brief flicker of modern life suggests. A story measured not just in years or centuries, but in reversals, excursions, and the patient counting of tree rings under restless skies. The magnetic field will change again someday. The sky will go strange again. But tonight, for now, the shield still holds. The stars still shine through the thin protective shell of air and force lines that cradle this world. The universe outside remains as fierce as ever, but you are here, breathing slowly, held within a bubble of invisible protection shaped by fire at the center of the earth. And as you let your eyes grow heavy, you can carry with you that quiet, steady knowledge that others before you have watched the sky burn and still found ways to live, to create, to care for one another. Whatever storms come, that ancient capacity for adaptation waits within you, ready if ever it is needed again. Imagine for a moment that you're standing not on the surface of the earth, but within its history itself. Around you there are no walls, no ceiling, no floor. Instead, there are layers, bands of colour and texture stretching up and down into infinity, like pages of stone in a book that never ends. Each layer is a moment in time, pressed flat, cooled, buried and lifted again. Somewhere in those bands the Adams event is written, not in words, but in the way tiny minerals quietly turn to face a weakened, wandering magnetic field. If you could reach out and touch one of these layers, you'd feel the roughness of basalt that once flowed as lava across the seabed. Suspended inside it are microscopic crystals of magnetite and hematite, iron-bearing minerals that form as molten rock cools. As each crystal solidifies, like a tiny compass needle freezing in place, it aligns with the magnetic field that exists at that moment. Billions and billions of these grains together record the direction and strength of Earth's magnetism when the rock passed from liquid to solid. This is paleomagnetism, the science of reading those frozen compass needles. When researchers collect basalt from long-cooled lava flows, they're not just sampling rocks, they're sampling snapshots of the field itself, little records of north is over there, captured across millions of years. When scientists began comparing these snapshots from different ages and locations, they stumbled onto something astonishing. Instead of all the arrows pointing more or less in the same direction, as you might expect if the magnetic field had been stable, they found whole sequences where the arrows flipped. Flows above a certain layer had minerals pointing roughly toward the current magnetic north. Flows below pointed the opposite way. It was as though someone had reversed the polarity of the entire planet. Once those reversals were recognized, researchers found them everywhere. On land, on the ocean floor, in mountain ranges that had once been seabeds, in volcanic plateaus. Every time a lava flow cooled, it had quietly written another line in Earth's magnetic diary. If you zoom further out in your imagination, you can picture the ocean floor as a vast tape recorder. As magma wells up along mid-ocean ridges and spreads outward, it cools and locks in the current magnetic direction. Over tens of millions of years, this creates stripes, long alternating bands of normal and reversed polarity mirrored on either side of the ridges. When research ships towed magnetometers across the seafloor in the 20th century, they mapped those bands and realized they were looking at the slow, steady spreading of the ocean crust, and at a record of countless field flips. Some reversals are complete, lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Others are brief flickers, excursions where the field weakens, tilts, and then snaps back. The Adams event sits in that second category, paired with a shorter, sharper magnetic excursion known as the Lachon event, named after a site in France where lava flows captured its signature. From the viewpoint of stone, the difference between an excursion and a full reversal is all about duration and geometry. But for living creatures, for those breathing under the red auroras and watching the lightning storms, the difference is mostly academic. What matters is that the shield falters, the radiation rises, and everything that lives must decide, unconsciously, behaviourally, genetically, how it will respond. The kauri tree in New Zealand recorded that response in another way. Unlike basalt, wood doesn't care about magnetic direction. It cares about chemistry. Each year, as the tree pulled carbon dioxide from the air and turned it into solid matter, it became a quiet archivist of the atmosphere's composition. When cosmic rays increased during the Adams event, they struck nitrogen atoms in the upper air and created extra carbon-14, a radioactive isotope of carbon. The tree absorbed that carbon along with its stable cousin, carbon-12, and stitched both into its rings. Tens of thousands of years later, when humans cut sections from that long-buried trunk and measured the ratios of carbon isotopes in each ring, they saw the spikes. The levels of carbon-14 weren't just slightly elevated, they leapt upward in jagged peaks that corresponded to centuries of increased cosmic bombardment. It was like seeing a cardiogram of the atmosphere's stress response. Those spikes caused trouble of an unexpected kind. For decades, archaeologists and geologists have relied on carbon-14 dating to estimate the ages of organic remains: bones, charcoal, seeds, textiles. The basic principle is simple. Living organisms constantly exchange carbon with the atmosphere. When they die, that exchange stops, and the carbon-14 already present in their tissues begins to decay at a known rate. Measure how much is left, and you can estimate how long it has been since the organism died. This method assumes that the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has been roughly constant through time. But the kauri tree showed that during the Adams event that assumption breaks down. The spikes in cosmic radiation dramatically increased carbon-14 production, skewing the clock. If you try to date something that lived during that period without correcting for the spike, you'll get an age that's off by centuries. To fix this, scientists build calibration curves, charts that relate measured radiocarbon ages to actual calendar ages based on independent records like tree rings. The cowrie provided a crucial missing segment of that curve, a high-resolution look at a chaotic chapter in Earth's radiocarbon story. Each ring became a data point, a tiny correction factor that helps bring the entire timeline of human history into sharper focus. It's oddly poetic. A catastrophe that almost wiped us out now helps us reconstruct our past with greater precision. As you rest here, letting this story drift through your mind, you can imagine that tree standing century after century in a damp, misty forest, completely unaware that its patient growth would one day become a key to understanding both cosmic radiation and human survival. It simply lived, season after season, adding layer upon layer of wood as the skies above it shifted from normal to dangerous and slowly back again. Elsewhere on the planet, ice was performing a similar duty. High on the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, snow falls year after year, compressing into ice that traps tiny bubbles of ancient air. When scientists drill deep cores into these ice caps, they can read years like tree rings, but instead of wood, they examine thin layers of ice, dust, and trapped gas. Within those layers are isotopes like beryllium-10 and chlorine-36, also produced when cosmic rays smash into atoms in the atmosphere. During periods of heightened cosmic radiation, like the Adams event, the concentrations of those isotopes climb, leaving distinct bands in the ice. When researchers align these ice records with the cowrie rings and with paleomagnetic data from rocks, the patterns converge. Suddenly, what might have looked like isolated clues, a spike in carbon-14, a strange layer in Antarctic ice, a reversal signature in French basalt, all line up as different views of the same global event. You can think of it as a kind of triangulation. The cowrie tells you what the atmosphere felt. The ice tells you how the poles responded. The rocks tell you what the deep interior was doing. Together they reveal that the Adams event wasn't just a local oddity, it was a planet-wide reconfiguration. There's something quietly reassuring in that convergence. It means our reconstructions aren't just guesswork. They rest on multiple independent lines of evidence, like overlapping shadows that reveal the shape of a hidden object. Of course, none of the humans living through that time had the luxury of such perspective. For them, understanding came through direct experience, story, and intuition. Picture a group of hunter-gatherers standing at the mouth of a cave on a day when the sky seems wrong. The sun is still there, but its light feels harsher. The colours of the world around them look slightly off, as though a thin veil has been drawn over their eyes. A wind carries the smell of ozone and distant storms. They might not know the word ultraviolet, but they can feel it sting on their skin after too many hours exposed. They've learned through trial and error that certain times are more dangerous than others. Days when the auroras are visible even at dusk. Periods when the animals act strangely, when migratory herds appear sluggish or altered, when birds veer off their usual routes. Over generations, patterns begin to emerge. These are encoded in stories about red nights and angry skies, about seasons when one should spend more time underground or under heavy coverings. If someone in that group is particularly observant, they might notice correlations that others miss. Perhaps a patient elder keeps track of the phases of the moon, the position of stars, the timing of strange lights, the health of the people. They can't write, but they can remember, and they pass that memory on through song or tale. It's easy to romanticize this, to imagine wise shamans decoding cosmic events, but the reality was likely more brute and immediate. People adapted because individuals who didn't adapt suffered. Children whose skin was left uncovered under harsh UV might have burned badly, leaving scars or increasing their susceptibility to disease. Adults who stayed in exposed shelters during the worst storms may have become sick more often. Over time, habits that protected against these subtle harms would have spread, not because anyone understood the physics, but because the communities that adopted them quietly fared better. From the standpoint of evolution, the Adams event becomes a pressure cooker for human ingenuity. Traits that encourage experimentation, observation, and imitation, the foundations of culture, gain enormous value. A person who notices that ochre works as a sunscreen and shares that insight improves not just their own survival odds, but those of their kin. A group that is willing to rearrange its entire way of living, shifting its camps into caves and inventing new clothing styles, has an edge over groups that cling to older patterns. When you think about it that way, the line between biology and culture blurs. Our brains are part of our bodies. The capacity for symbolic thought, for complex language, for shared intentionality, these are as much evolutionary adaptations as opposable thumbs. During the Adams event, those capacities were tested and refined under conditions of extreme change. Many anthropologists think that this period coincides with an explosion of symbolic behavior, not just cave art, but decorated tools, ornaments, musical instruments. The same mental wiring that allowed humans to devise practical responses to increased radiation also allowed them to create myths, rituals, and songs. These cultural creations might seem frivolous at first glance, but they serve deep survival functions. Rituals coordinate group behavior. Myths reinforce important lessons. Songs carry information across generations in a form that is easy to remember and emotionally compelling. Imagine a lullaby from that era, sung softly in a cave glowing with firelight and ochre-stained walls. On the surface, it comforts a child and helps them sleep. Beneath the surface, it might encode warnings about certain kinds of weather, or about times when one must not stray from shelter. The child learns without having to experience the danger firsthand. Culture becomes a buffer against the raw brutality of environment. As you listen now, centuries and continents away from that cave, you're engaging with the same basic mechanism. A story about an ancient magnetic collapse flows through your ears and into your mind, giving you a sense, however faint, of how to think about global change, about vulnerability and resilience. You're not dodging ultraviolet rays in a world without ozone, but you are living in a time when planetary systems are once again shifting rapidly. The past gives you a set of mental tools, analogies, and patterns that might help you respond when the future demands it. Scientists, in their own way, sing a similar song when they model magnetic reversals. They construct simulations of the geodynamo, the restless motion of the liquid outer core, using supercomputers. In these virtual Earths, they tweak the flows of molten metal, the rotation rates, the boundary conditions. Sometimes the model's magnetic field remains stable. Other times it wobbles or flips or collapses into excursions eerily similar to the Lachance and Adams events. What they've discovered is that the geodynamo seems inherently chaotic. Reversals and excursions are not rare glitches. They are an expected part of the system's behavior. The field can remain in a stable orientation for hundreds of thousands or even millions of years, and then, without any external trigger, reorganize itself dramatically. To your sleeping mind, that might feel unsettling at first. It means that stability is always provisional. The quiet, steady compass we carry through most of history is, in the grand scheme, a temporary alignment. But there's another side to that realization. We're living in a world that has already passed through countless such upheavals. Life has survived them again and again, The geodynamo has reversed hundreds of times in Earth's history, and yet the planet remains rich with ecosystems. What makes the Adams event special is that it brushed so close to the emergence of fully modern humans. It happened precisely when our cognitive and cultural capacities were blooming. That timing is what allowed tree rings and ice cores and stone tools to converge into a story we can reconstruct with unusual clarity. If you were to wander further back along those layers of basalt and ice, beyond the last 42,000 years, you'd find earlier magnetic dramas that unfolded in worlds very different from our own. There was the Brunus-Matuyama reversal about 780,000 years ago, when our ancestors were still experimenting with hand axes and fire. There were rapid polarity flips during the Cretaceous period, when dinosaurs ruled forested continents and the first flowering plants were spreading. In those times, there were no humans to paint caves or sing songs, but other creatures adapted in their own ways. Some lineages died out, others diversified, whole ecosystems restructured and then stabilized again as the field recovered. It's humbling to realize that the machinery at the center of the Earth doesn't care who lives on the surface. The molten iron doesn't know about kauri trees or cave paintings or satellites. It churns according to laws of physics that operate on timescales measured not in years, but in millions of years. Our entire species has existed for only a few brief turns of that core. Yet, for this short stretch, we have something no other species has ever had. The ability to know that the core exists, to measure its effects, to anticipate some of its moods. We can watch the South Atlantic anomaly deepen on satellite maps. We can calculate how quickly the magnetic North Pole is moving. We can quantify how much the field has weakened since the first compass needles floated in bowls of water centuries ago. From a certain perspective, that knowledge is just another kind of ochre, a protective pigment, this time made of information rather than minerals. It doesn't shield us directly from radiation, but it allows us to design shields. We know, for instance, that critical transformers on power grids can be equipped with systems to detect and divert geomagnetically induced currents. We know that satellites can be placed in orbits less vulnerable to particle storms or built with hardened electronics. We know that backup navigation systems based on inertial measurements or ground beacons can step in when GPS falters. Whether we choose to apply that intellectual ochre widely and proactively is another matter. But the capacity exists. While you lie there, you might picture a kind of conversation across time. Early humans mixing ochre in stone bowls by the light of fire. Modern engineers mixing alloys in foundries and fabricating radiation-hardened circuits. Both are, in their own eras, trying to answer the same question. How do we live under a sky that sometimes turns against us? You can also imagine another set of hands at work, those of future humans, or whatever our descendants become. They may live in habitats designed from the ground up for variable magnetic conditions, with shielding integrated into walls and roofs, with power systems that don't rely on long, vulnerable lines. For them, the failure of satellites might be an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe, because their everyday technologies would have grown from assumptions of instability rather than stability. In their schools, children might learn about the Adams event not as an obscure episode, but as a foundational story. There was a time, their teachers would say, when our ancestors walked under skies of red light, when they did not yet understand what a magnetosphere was. They survived by painting caves and sewing clothes. We survive by designing fields and building resilient networks. But the lesson is the same. The sky can change. We adapt. Those descendants may even look back at our current age the way we look at the people in the caves, a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. admiration for the incredible leap in knowledge and technology, bewilderment at how dependent we allowed ourselves to become on fragile systems. In that sense, your own lifetime sits at a hinge point. You are close enough to the deep past to feel its pressures, through archaeology, through paleoclimate studies, through reconstructions of events like the Adams excursion, and close enough to the near future to see how those pressures might return in new forms. It's a lot for one mind to hold, especially late at night when the world around you grows quiet. But you don't have to hold it all. It's enough just to let the images pass. The churning iron core, the auroras over Ice Age valleys, the Corrie tree absorbing radiation-spiked carbon, the scientists measuring those rings under fluorescent lab lights, the satellites tracing the weakening field, the engineers sketching designs for more resilient systems, the unknown people yet to come, living within whatever sky the Earth gives them. Somewhere in that chain, you find your own place. One tiny link, but a necessary one. You carry, without thinking about it most days, the same adaptability that got your ancestors through their red sky years. You carry, consciously now, the knowledge that the shield above us is both fragile and astonishingly robust, that it has broken and reformed many times without ending life, though not without changing it. In the dark, with your eyes closed, you might even imagine feeling that field. Not as a literal sense, our bodies aren't tuned to feel it directly, but as an awareness humming at the edge of perception, a vast, invisible structure wrapping the globe, deflecting most of what the sun throws at us, trembling slightly as the core murmurs as solar winds increase and fade. The next time you see an image of shimmering auroras taken from space, you'll know a little more about what you're looking at, not just pretty lights, but the visible edges of a shield tested in fire 42,000 years ago, scarred and healed and still for now holding. And somewhere, deep in a museum or a laboratory freezer, thin slices of Corrie wood continue to rest quietly in their boxes, their rings counting out the years when that shield nearly failed, when the sky bled red and human beings answered not with surrender, but with pigment, clothing, stories, and an unspoken agreement. We change or we vanish. That agreement has never really expired. It runs underneath every generation, binding them to the next. The Adams event simply made it obvious for a while. Then the field recovered, the auroras retreated, the immediate pressure eased, and the agreement sank back into the background of life. It is still there now, a quiet clause in the contract between our species and the planet it rides upon. That unspoken agreement, change or vanish, may sound harsh when you hear it phrased so plainly, but if you stretch your imagination back across the whole history of life, it is also one of the most beautiful truths we know. Every creature that has ever walked, flown, swum, or rooted itself into the ground has had to keep that agreement. Bacteria changing their chemistry when oxygen first appeared in the oceans. Plants inventing leaves and roots when life moved onto land. Fish turning fins into limbs. Mammals learning to keep their bodies warm in a cooling world. At every turn the planet has shifted, and life has answered with new shapes, new strategies, new ways of being. The Adams event was simply one of the louder conversations in that long dialogue. If you could somehow zoom out in time, compressing millions of years into a few minutes, Earth would not look like a stable blue marble. It would flicker and shimmer and pulse. Continents would slide and collide. Ice sheets would grow and melt. Sea levels would rise and fall like slow tides. The magnetic field would wobble, flip, weaken, and strengthen. Through it all, the thin film of life would cling to mountains, shorelines, forests, reefs, deserts, sometimes shrinking, sometimes exploding in sudden bursts of diversity. You and I happen to be living in a relatively calm chapter of that story. The continents still move, but so slowly that you measure their motion with satellites, not with your eyes. The climate is changing more quickly than in recent human history, but compared to the great upheavals of the deep past, we're still at the beginning of the curve. The magnetic field is weakening, but the auroras are still confined mostly to high latitudes, and the sky remains, on most nights, a familiar darkness. That calm can be misleading. It invites you to think of stability as the default state and change as the exception, when in reality the opposite is true. Change is the rule. Stability is the brief pause between waves. Yet that realization doesn't have to feel frightening. It can also feel strangely liberating. If everything is always changing anyway, then our job is not to freeze reality in place. Our job is to move with it as gracefully as we can. Your ancestors during the Adams event didn't know why the sky had turned red, why the storms had intensified, why some animals were disappearing. They didn't know about molten cores or solar winds or cosmic rays, but they knew they had to move with the change. So they rewrote their days. They woke before dawn to hunt while the sun was still low. They learned to read the quality of light on the horizon, to sense when the air carried more bite than usual. On harsh days they stayed near cliffs and caves, used overhangs and shadows as shields. They experimented with layers of hides, with hoods, with makeshift veils. They discovered that certain times of year were more dangerous than others, that certain directions of sky held more threat. They learned to tell those patterns in stories, in warnings given to children, in ritual rules about when to travel and when to stay hidden. Around the fire, in the evenings, when the worst of the radiation had eased and the red glow in the sky was a little softer, they talked. They talked about the animals they'd seen behave strangely, about unusual illnesses, about days when the light felt too sharp. They compared notes across families and bands. They argued, disagreed, laughed, and eventually converged on a shared sense of what worked. That is culture at its simplest, a memory system that extends beyond individual brains, storing experiences in stories and customs so that the next generation doesn't have to relearn everything from scratch. You are part of that same memory system even now. The fact that you're lying here listening to a story about a magnetic excursion that happened 42,000 years ago is itself a form of cultural adaptation. Knowledge that began as an odd pattern in tree rings and ice cores has been turned into narrative, into an image you can hold in your mind while you drift towards sleep. Those early humans would probably be astonished at the specifics, at satellites, electricity, laboratories, microphones, and screens. But they would understand the core of what you're doing. You're trying to orient yourself in time. You're asking silently, what sort of world am I living in, and how do I move through it? That question has always been one of our species' deepest instincts. We pointed at the stars and drew patterns between them to answer it. We traced animal tracks in dust and snow. We carved tally marks into bones and wood. We told myths about sky gods arguing and seas rising and falling. We learned to attach meaning to cycles, the return of seasons, the migration of herds, the phases of the moon, the shift of constellations. When the Adams event struck, those cycles must have felt disrupted. Night skies that had been predictable for generations suddenly erupted with colour. Storm patterns shifted. The relationship between sun and skin changed. The world's rules had not been broken exactly, but some of them had been rewritten in a language nobody yet understood. Part of what made modern humans so successful was our capacity to tolerate that uncertainty without collapsing. We could hold in our minds the possibility that some things simply didn't make sense yet, and still continue to experiment with practical responses. You can carry that same attitude into your own life now. You don't know exactly how climate change will reshape your region, or how quickly magnetic field weakening will proceed, or which technologies will endure and which will fail. But you can pay attention. You can notice patterns. You can build small experiments into your days, learning a new practical skill, trying a different way of connecting with your community, setting aside redundancies in how you organize your work and your home. In that sense, the story of the Adams event is not just about cosmic radiation or geomagnetic physics. It's about the psychological skill of living in a world whose foundations occasionally tremble. Imagine yourself back in one of those ancient caves, just for a moment. The air inside is cool and still. The floor is uneven, but worn smooth in places by generations of feet. Somewhere deeper in the darkness you hear water dripping, a steady rhythm like a slow heartbeat. The only light comes from a fire at the centre of the chamber, its flames low and steady, its smoke curling upward to find cracks in the rock. On the walls around you, ochre figures dance, animals frozen mid-stride, handprints like ghostly signatures, spirals and dots and lines whose meaning is half obvious and half lost. The firelight makes them move, just a little, as shadows flicker. Outside maybe the sky's boiling with auroras, lightning forks in the distance, a wind laced with strange charges moves across the valley. But in here, for this moment, there is shelter, there is story. Someone begins to speak. Maybe an elder, voice rough but firm. Maybe a younger hunter who has seen new things beyond the ridge. Maybe a parent, soothing a restless child. They talk about a time before the sky went red, passed down from their own elders. They talk about how their people once walked farther from shelter, spent more hours under open sky, followed herds across wide plains without worrying about invisible dangers. They talk too about what they've learned since, about how red ochre helps, how certain caves stay cooler, how using layered clothing and sheltering at midday seems to keep people healthier. They may not frame it as science, but the process is the same. Observe, test, remember, share. Then, when the fire burns lower and the dangerous hours pass, the cave quiets. People lie down near one another, parents and children, siblings and friends, and let their breathing fall into a shared rhythm. The world outside is still chaotic, still dangerous. But inside this circle of cooperation and memory there is a kind of peace. You participate in a remarkably similar ritual now, even if the details look different. Instead of stone walls, you might have painted plaster or bare concrete. Instead of a fire, you have the soft glow of a lamp or the dim light from a screen that will soon go dark. Instead of ochre figures, there are books, images, or the quiet hum of your own imagination. But the pattern is identical. Before sleep, you gather stories that help you orient yourself. You remind your mind that humans have faced uncertainty before and learned to move through it. You place yourself in a lineage that stretches back far beyond recorded history and will, with luck, extend far into the future. In that lineage, the Adams event is just one chapter among many, but it is a useful one because it reminds you that the planet has known far worse conditions than anything we face at this exact moment, and that your ancestors met those conditions with creativity, cooperation, and a willingness to change. At the same time, the story warns you gently not to take your current comforts for granted. It suggests, in a quiet way, that investing a little time now in resilience, in learning, in community, in flexibility, is a wise response to living on a restless world. That combination of humility and confidence is a good mindset to fall asleep with. Humility, because you understand that you are small compared to the forces that shape magnetic fields and climate. Confidence, because you carry within you the same adaptive capacity that turned ochre into sunscreen and caves into sanctuaries. As your body settles more deeply into rest, you can let the technical details drift away. You no longer need to hold on to terms like Lachance excursion, or South Atlantic anomaly, or cosmic ray flux. Those belong to your waking mind, to the part of you that enjoys puzzles and patterns. What you keep, in the quiet of this moment, is something simpler. You keep the image of a tree in New Zealand drinking in sunlight while the sky above it glows with extra radiation, unconcerned yet recording everything in its rings. You keep the image of ice sheets forming slow, silent archives of past atmospheres, layering snow upon snow while the magnetic field flips and recovers overhead. You keep the image of early humans, heads tilted back, watching the sky blaze red and green and violet, feeling fear but also awe, then turning and walking into caves to mix pigments by firelight. You keep the image of the earth itself cross-sectioned in your mind, a thin crust, a viscous mantle, a molten metal core churning and spinning, generating a field that extends far beyond the atmosphere, shaping the paths of particles from the sun. You keep most of all the feeling that all of this is one continuous story, and that your life, your breathing right now, your heartbeat slowing as you relax, is a small but real part of it. There is a temptation, when hearing about ancient catastrophes, to imagine that everything is poised on the edge of disaster, that one day soon we will wake up and find the sky suddenly going red again, the satellites falling silent, the grids collapsing. The reality is usually more gradual. Magnetic fields weaken over centuries, climate trends play out over decades, technology adapts, fails, adapts again. Warnings are raised, ignored, heard, and sometimes finally acted upon. You don't have to solve all of that tonight. Tonight, your work is much simpler. You allow your nervous system to downshift after a day of stimulation. You give your brain permission to wander through images of trees, caves, stars, and swirling fields until it finds its own way into dreams. You let your muscles unclench, your jaw softened, your shoulders sink a little heavier into whatever is supporting you. As your breathing deepens, you might notice how, in the darkness behind your closed eyes, stray flickers of light appear and fade. Little internal auroras, generated not by solar winds, but by neurons settling into slower rhythms. They drift and change shape just as the real auroras do, but on a much smaller scale, all within the theatre of your own mind. You can imagine those inner lights synchronizing with something larger, with the slow oscillations of the planet's magnetic field, with the tides pulled by the moon, with the daily cycle of light and dark that has rocked life to sleep for billions of nights. Human beings have always slept under a sky shaped by forces they barely understood. Before compasses, before maps, before equations, there was only the felt rhythm of day and night, the waxing and waning of the moon, the long, slow tilt of seasons. We aligned our bodies and our stories to those rhythms long before we could calculate them. When the Adams event twisted those rhythms for a while, we bent with them, and then, when the field recovered, we bent back. You are the inheritor of that flexibility. If another great magnetic excursion comes in your lifetime, or in the lives of people you care about, it will not arrive without warning. You will see it in the malfunctioning satellites, in the maps of strengthening anomalies, in the increased frequency of strong solar storms. Researchers will model scenarios, engineers will suggest upgrades, communities will decide what to protect and how. If it doesn't come for many centuries, then this story will remain what it is tonight. A piece of deep time perspective, a reminder that our current concerns are nested inside larger cycles that have been playing out long before there were humans to name them. Either way, the practical wisdom remains the same. Look for shelter when the sky behaves strangely, whether that strangeness is literal or metaphorical. Share what you learn with others. Be willing to change your habits when the environment shifts. Remember that you come from a line of survivors who've already passed some of the harshest tests this planet can offer. Let that knowledge soften the edges of fear. The Earth will continue to turn. Its core will continue to churn. Fields will weaken and recover. Climates will swing. Life will adapt in ways we can't yet imagine. Some lineages will end, others will begin. Through it all, there will be nights like this one, where someone, somewhere, lies awake for a while, thinking about their place in the story. You right now are one of those people. You've spent time walking through ancient storms in your imagination, watching auroras explode across ice age skies, listening to the quiet ticking of tree rings counting cosmic rays. You've visited caves lit by ochre and fire, laboratories humming with instruments, orbital paths traced by satellites. You've drifted alongside molten iron at the center of the Earth, and floated above the atmosphere where the magnetic field lines curve like invisible ribbons. That is a lot of travelling for one mind in one evening. It's all right to come home now. Home in this case is simply your own body resting where it is. The familiar weight of your limbs, the sensation of fabric or blankets against your skin, the faint sounds of your surroundings, the rise and fall of your chest. As you notice those details, you can let the rest of the story recede. Not discarded, but filed away in the deeper shelves of memory, where it may return later in dreams or in quiet moments of curiosity. For now, you don't need to think about magnetic poles or ozone or cosmic rays. You don't need to imagine red skies or ancient caves. You can let your mind grow simpler, like a landscape fading toward dusk. Thoughts slow, images stretch and blur. Sentences in your head become fragments, then single words, then something softer than words. Breath in, breath out. Somewhere above you, beyond ceiling and roof and clouds, the magnetosphere still hums, catching most of what the sun sends our way. Solar wind streams past, diverted into great arcs that wrap behind the planet. Particle storms shoot along field lines toward the poles, lighting up the upper atmosphere in colours that, right now, someone far to the north or south might be watching with quiet wonder. You don't need to see it. It works whether you notice it or not. In the same way, the adaptive capacities that kept your ancestors alive are still quietly present in you. You don't need to feel them to know they're there. They will wake when they are needed. Tonight, what is needed is rest. Human beings have survived red skies, ice ages, volcanic winters, shifting fields and wandering poles. They did it one day at a time, one night of sleep at a time, taking care of their small circles while the planet turned and storms raged beyond their control. You can do the same. Trust that the world will keep its own vigil while you sleep. The trees recording the air, the ice recording the cold, the scientists watching their instruments, the satellites tracing magnetic anomalies, the storytellers turning data into meaning. Your task for these next hours is only to loosen your grip on consciousness and allow your mind to drift. Let the story settle like dust after a storm, falling gently onto the surface of your thoughts. Let the long arc of time curve around you like a protective shell. Let your breathing become the only rhythm that matters, and when sleep finally takes you, as it did your ancestors under auroral skies and cave ceilings, remember at least in some quiet corner of your awareness, that you are part of a species that has already learned, again and again, how to live when the sky itself seems to break. The field may weaken, the lights may flare, the rules may shift. But for now, in this moment, the shield still holds. You're safe enough to close your eyes. You're allowed to rest.